Hello friends, you are on a channel dedicated to reviewing the situation on the front. Today is April 24th, and many events have happened in the past 24 hours. Before we begin, I would like to ask you to subscribe. Your support helps the channel develop. Many thanks to everyone who has already subscribed. Now let's move on to reviewing the current situation. So let's first touch on political news. As you may have heard, the negotiations in London have essentially failed. The reason is simple: Zelensky categorically refuses to compromise. There are rumors that Trump is very unhappy with this and is losing patience. Well, we are waiting for Starlink to be turned off and the transmission of intelligence and military support to cease. In the meantime, there is movement on the front. Let's open the map and see what has changed in the last 24 hours. There is one area where the Ukrainian armed forces' positions are literally crumbling, and I will now show you this clearly. The Ukrainian forces are unable to hold the line of defense there. Before moving on to this, I will briefly talk about the situation in the Sumy region. Here, Russian troops are experiencing certain difficulties in the area of the village of Lochnia. Let me remind you that our troops had previously broken through there, but the Ukrainian armed forces were able to stabilize the situation. For more than 2 weeks, the front here remained unchanged. Both sides held their positions, although the Ukrainian armed forces were actively replenishing their forces from neighboring Yunakovka. Lochnia and Yunakovka, in fact, form a single space, so supplying and bringing reserves there is not a problem for the Ukrainians. As a result, they concentrated a strike group there and launched an offensive, pushing Russian forces back almost a kilometer. Now, Russian units are barely holding the northern outskirts of Lochnia, and there is no talk of an offensive on Yunakovka in the near future. The battles for Lochnia promise to be long. However, there are successes in another part of the Sumy region. For example, Vasilievka is already under Russian control, which is confirmed by video footage and even by American cartographers. From there, the closest target is Belov, just 2 kilometers away. Taking this village will make it possible to clear the entire northern pocket and approach Yunakovka from the other side. Gornali is also being stormed, where Ukrainian troops have found themselves isolated and are not receiving reinforcements. So the situation in Sumy Oblast is ambiguous. In one place, the Ukrainian armed forces are attacking, in another, they are retreating. In Kursk and Belgorod Oblasts, there are no serious changes yet. But given the crossing of the river and the actions of Russian units in the rear of Gornali, positive news can be expected. And now let's move on to the area where the Ukrainian armed forces are losing control over their positions. We are talking about the direction to the west of Toretsk, specifically the Mirnograd-Toretsk area. Here, the advance of Russian troops is accelerating. Thus, yesterday Tarasovka was finally taken, and to the east, the forces of the 150th Division, which had previously liberated Sukhaya Balka, began to encircle Petrovka and Sherbinovka from the west and are moving towards Romanovka. There is already information that Russian fighters entered Petrovka from the western side. The outskirts of Staraya Nikolaevka have also been reached. The Ukrainian front is literally crumbling here, and a retreat across the Bychok River looks increasingly inevitable. In this direction, not only the terrain features play a key role, but also the work of Russian drones, which effectively destroy Ukrainian fortifications. The advance from Leonidovka to Petrovka was about 3 kilometers. The Ukrainian armed forces were completely driven out of Sukha Balka, and Russian forces have already begun moving north. Given the blockade from both sides, it will be difficult for the Ukrainian armed forces to hold this territory, especially with a lack of reserves. According to even Ukrainian sources, Russian units have come close to the southern outskirts of Staraya Nikolaevka, and an assault is expected in the near future. Artillery and aviation are already conducting intensive processing before the attack. Even despite the transfer of reserves during the Easter truce, the Ukrainians were unable to stabilize the situation, and the front continues to retreat. The loss of Tarasovka confirms this. After it, the likely direction of attack will be Alexandropol and then Zaria, where the Russian forces may join up. So we see the capture of Sukha Balka, a 3-kilometer advance, access to Staraya Nikolaevka, the fall of Tarasovka, all this in one area. It is obvious that the Ukrainian armed forces are unable to stop the enemy's advance. Also, in another area, near the village of Bagotyr, American maps confirmed the capture of territory that was actually under the control of Russian troops just a few days ago. Now the Russian army is preparing for heavy fighting for the village itself. In general, the situation on the front is developing in a positive direction. The pace of advance in April is higher than in previous months, despite the fact that the large-scale summer campaign has not yet begun. Given the current losses of the Ukrainian armed forces and the subsidence of the front, we can well expect a large-scale breakthrough in some direction in the summer. Perhaps we will again see an advance of 50 square kilometers per day, as has already happened. And it is even more unclear why Zelensky continues to refuse proposals for a ceasefire. In his situation, this looks irrational because the front is shrinking. Pokrovsk direction, here the actions of the Russian army are becoming increasingly obvious. While the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to hold on to the Dnipropetrovsk region, Russian units of the center group have launched a full-scale offensive towards Pokrovsk. From the west, fighting is taking place near the village of Zverevo. It has already been practically cleared. There is only a kilometer left to Pokrovsk. To the east, an offensive is beginning along the railway to the Chinushino station. Next is Lisovka, the western part of which is already occupied. In the east, fierce fighting continues for Mirolyubovka, where the Ukrainian armed forces are holding on with all their might. Russian aviation is actively striking the rear. Thus, along the entire front south of Pokrovsk, an advance towards the city is beginning. The Novopavlovsk direction also remains active. Here, fighting continues between the Volchya and Solinaya rivers. The Ukrainian armed forces are trying to prevent a breakthrough into the Dnipropetrovsk region by concentrating their forces in this area. However, despite their efforts, Russian forces have advanced into the northwestern part of Orikovo. This is the last village before the border, which is about 500 meters away. The flanks to the north, between Nadayevka and Novoaleksandrivka, and to the south of Troitskoye are also being leveled. The appearance of foliage plays an important role, reducing the effectiveness of Ukrainian drones. Nature is increasingly helping to advance. The American authorities have once again attracted the attention of the world community with colorful statements. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that during discussions of the situation around Ukraine in Washington, they began to better understand Moscow's arguments. Almost simultaneously, Pentagon Chief Peter Hegseth, also part of the president's inner circle, said the time when the United States alone acted as a guarantor of European security is in the past. Can this be regarded as a diplomatic victory for Russia in the European context? It is still premature. The path to the end is still far away. But do such signals from the American capital mean a positive shift? Of course, yes, and it would be a mistake to perceive them solely as short-term political moves. Today, there is every reason to assume the possibility of forming a strategic agreement. This was precisely the goal of Russia's proposals on security in Europe, made back in December 2021. The path turned out to be difficult and costly in human terms. But this is the essence of global politics. Large-scale changes almost never happen peacefully. The fundamental problem with European security is that it has been built as anti-Russian since the end of World War II. Even in cases where the USSR or the Russian Federation formally participated in its structures, this only served as a tool for limiting Russian influence. This was precisely what the Western approach was based on, a containment strategy, which, as Henry Kissinger argued, ensured the legitimacy of the world architecture. After 1945, Western states agreed that containing Moscow was the most important thing, including their own independence, especially at the European level. Rejecting this logic means recognizing that the old order is no longer relevant and that a new one needs to be built, with different principles for relations between the West and Russia. The current changes in the United States make us think that such a development is possible. Although we are still very far from being sure of this,